I'm Laura Lucas Magnuson, and this is The World Unpacked.
You'd be forgiven for asking, what is going on with the AstraZeneca vaccine in Europe? In January, there were bitter words about delays in its supply. There was an insistence that the EU would act as one on vaccines. Then in February, it became clear many AstraZeneca doses in the EU were yet to be used. And now in March, some EU countries, including France and Germany, have acted on their own and suspended its use.
And the government has warned the European Union that any attempt to block the export of coronavirus vaccines to the UK would be counterproductive. The defence
comes down to this. The transatlantic alliance is a strong foundation, the strong foundation on which our collective security and our shared prosperity are built.
I think we really now have a unique opportunity to strengthen our transatlantic bond, to open a new chapter in the relationship between North America and Europe.
The main reason I'm here is to reaffirm strongly the United States' commitment to NATO, to this alliance, and to our partnerships. When we look at virtually all of the challenges that we face, not a single one of them can be effectively dealt with by any one country acting alone.
How will NATO and the US continue to address the challenges posed by Russia and a rising China?
So the main thing is that as long as we stand together, we can deal with both the rising China and assertive and aggressive Russia. That's exactly the reason why we have NATO.
After an anguishing start to the coronavirus pandemic that saw one of its early epicenters in Italy, Europe's response to the pandemic was an opportunity to rally around creating a massive recovery fund for the continent and promising to support recoveries in the global south. Since those optimistic days, the continent has seen deadly new waves of the virus and fallen behind on vaccination campaigns, despite the UK developing a successful vaccine. Europe also has been caught up in the last few weeks in a tense back and forth with China on issues related to sanctions on China's treatment of its weaker population. What happened with Europe's vaccine rollout, and what are the implications for future cooperation? How can Europe work with allies across the Atlantic to address increasing challenges from China and tackle other global issues like climate change? Here to answer these questions is Rosa Belfer, the director of Carnegie Europe in Brussels. Welcome, Rosa.
Hi, Laura.
Rosa, a lot has changed since we last had you on the pod back in September last year. And at that time, Europe had just agreed to a 750 billion euro coronavirus recovery fund. And many of the countries across the continent had effectively managed the first wave of the pandemic, reducing death rates, hospitalizations, and infection rates. But now we're seeing a new wave of infections sweep across Europe. Stalled vaccination rates related in part to a controversy over the UK vaccine, and bureaucratic red tape hindering the economic package. What happened with Europe's vaccine rollout, and what are the implications for future cooperation?
Well, indeed, it's been, I think the premise has to be that with this coronavirus pandemic, there's a lot of volatility. It's very hard to predict how the crisis will end. And Europe, after a rough start, actually managed to get its act together and, as you mentioned, agreed to this large recovery package back in July. And it looked like the future looked fairly bright at that point, especially by comparison with the US, where the virus was really dealt with a certain amount of chaos. So now it looks like it's gone the other way round. So why is it? The immediate problems are very much to do with the availability of the vaccine. And once during the month of April, more doses will be available, that will be the opportunity for the member states to demonstrate that they can actually carry out the vaccine distribution and get back onto a better ratio, which can compete with the ratios of vaccination in the UK and in the US. But it also shows some of the weaknesses of the European Union project. Stefan Lehne will publish something with Carnegie Europe tomorrow, which says the EU is too integrated not to cooperate on vaccine, but not integrated enough to do it effectively. Health is not an EU competence. And the Commission has been dealing with procurement, with pharmaceuticals, dealing with health, without actually having the expertise and the competence to do that. This happens in a highly litigious context because all governments, all politicians across Europe are panicking because of the loss of trust of the public, because of the slow rollout of the vaccine. So they're all panicking and looking for others to blame. So this is the political context in which we are at the moment. Looking forward, first of all, I think once the doses are available, it will be possible for Europe to bounce back on this, at least on the health front. But looking forward, we can also see that implementing the recovery fund, issuing the actual money so that member states can start investing in their economy and building back better, this has been slower than expected. So there's a risk if the pandemic continues and if Europe doesn't bounce back on the health front by the summer, there's a risk that come September, even on the economic front, the fallout will be far greater. So a lot is at stake at the moment. We're not seeing the most exemplary behaviour of European politicians and leaders these days, but it is still possible for the EU as a whole to address these problems if they manage to collectively get the sort of strategic outlook together. But it is a difficult moment for the EU, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's been challenging to say the least. You mentioned the ratios of vaccination. So the US and the UK have administered about 37 and 45 vaccine doses per 100 people, respectively, compared to about 13 in the EU. What explains the UK's speed compared to the EU? And especially in a post-Brexit world, how are the Europeans viewing the UK's relative success?
Well, that's the thing. The whole pandemic, the dispute with the UK over deliveries and with AstraZeneca, the pharmaceutical company which is producing this vaccine, they're all very much conditioned and by Brexit, by the divorce, which happened in the middle of this pandemic, and the relationship has been bitter, to say the least. It would be important in this post-Brexit period, with such a thin agreement between the UK and the EU, it would have been important to avoid all sorts of disputes and start building a relationship that looks towards the future. This is not happening. And in fact, there have been several diplomatic spats to the extent that the UK does not recognise the EU ambassador to the UK and vice versa as a consequence. So the relationship, at the moment, the relationship is in a bad place. I would say that because, the UK had a very bad coronavirus pandemic.
Yes.
Very badly handled in the early months. It had a second wave in the autumn, which was devastating again. And the government had to make several U-turns. It was much more incoherent than most European governments in managing the pandemic. But it got a better deal in terms of acquiring vaccines, and has thus managed to move ahead much more rapidly. And it's likely that the UK economy will also bounce back a little bit more than the European economy. Therefore, the UK government, which is the Brexit-driven, very strongly ideological Brexit-driven government, can cover up the economic losses of Brexit, blaming the pandemic. This also means potentially that, and this I think also we need to take into account the fact that there is a government in the US which is pro-European and pro-UK, so that the context has changed. So potentially at this point, Boris Johnson could perhaps, it wouldn't be too difficult a political move to, offer an olive branch to the EU, given that at this particular moment in time, the UK is in a better position as far as health is concerned, and also as far as public opinion is concerned. The Boris Johnson government at this moment is doing quite well in the polls. Unlike, he managed really to turn around his political standing in the country thanks to the vaccination rollout.
I want to talk more about the economic recovery in a minute, but one more question on the vaccines. How do you think that the EU's actions of limiting the export of vaccines might impact its relationships with partners in the developing world, especially where competitors such as China and Russia are also trying to make inroads with so-called vaccine diplomacy?
So it's interesting because a lot of it is really about messaging and diplomacy. The UK and the US are not exporting their vaccines at all. They're keeping it 100% for domestic consumption. The statistics for the EU are slightly better. They're not brilliant, but the EU is keeping slightly more than 50% of its vaccines for domestic use, but it is continuing to export. So in reality, the EU is actually trying to support poorer countries. It's a drop in the ocean in the sense that until the rest of the world, until we've acquired herd immunity globally, nobody's going to be safe. And we know that in large parts of the global south, they're nowhere near the numbers needed. And they won't be during the course of 2021 unless something dramatic happens. So the EU is doing some of what it should be doing, not all of it, but is messaging it very badly. So the spat over AstraZeneca, for instance, and the smear campaign against AstraZeneca, which was really based on quite irrational, panicked motivations, has had a devastating impact in those countries, poorer countries, which have had to acquire AstraZeneca because AstraZeneca is the cheapest vaccination. If the smear campaign reverberates in developing countries, and then even those who have the vaccine are not able to use it because of some speculation on part of some European politician, that is hugely problematic. So it really is more the messaging and the diplomacy around vaccines that has played a dent, is denting the relationship between Europe and the global south than the reality of it, where the EU is still importing, certainly more so than the US and the UK, which tend to be the sort of comparative, the frameworks for comparison.
Yeah, really good point. Going back to the economic recovery, sort of where does that piece stand now? And what do you think it will take for European leaders to work together to get the virus under control and propel, the continent itself toward a path of recovery?
Well, what the coronavirus did is break a taboo in Europe. So the EU has had, during the past 10 years, has been, the EU had just come out really of the financial crisis, of the consequences of the financial crisis of 2008. And it came out of it through politics of austerity that have alienated many Europeans, but that some European countries believe are the rule book of the Eurozone and how it has to be governed. So what happened with the agreement on the recovery fund was really quite a leap into a potential different new governance of the Eurozone. But it's not a treaty-based leap. It's just an ad hoc agreement. And the expectation is that the expectation on those who have been in favour of deepening the integration in the Eurozone, these are countries such as France, such as Italy, such as Spain. The hope is that from this lesson of the recovery fund, if it works, it will persuade those countries that don't like public debt that it's okay to make public investment, because that's basically the debate: big government or small austere government. And the EU recovery fund is a first step towards changing the terms of that debate. But it doesn't mean that it will happen in the future. It doesn't mean that it will become the new model for the Eurozone governance. And that change still needs to take place. And it will take place if the EU Recovery Fund is successfully implemented. Otherwise, it will become just an episode in the history of European integration. We don't know whether that's going to happen. I think they really need they really need to distribute the funds. They really need to see countries such as Italy, Spain, investing those funds in infrastructure, in going digital, in the green economy. That's what needs to be done. But of course, the duration of the pandemic is delaying this process. And come September, when support schemes for businesses that have to stay closed, or when it will be again possible to fire employees, all these emergency measures that have been introduced during this period, when they will come to an end, there's a risk that there's going to be a bit of an economic crisis.
Shades of a similar discussion that's happening here in the United States about, stimulus and how big and how it will play out. So what does this episode suggest to you about Europe's ability to tackle big problems?
Good question. Jean Monnet was famous for saying that Europe moves through crises. And I've never been 100% sure of this, because Europe has been going through, this is over a decade of crisis. So 2008, and it's just been one crisis after the next. And I don't think Europe has actually managed to make itself that much stronger. And the big problem is that it has been reluctant to make big leaps in political integration. So we still have a machinery and a construct which is very complicated, very cumbersome, where consensus needs to be built up slowly and patiently. And for certain kinds of crisis, this is not a good setup. It doesn't make the EU agile. It doesn't make the EU a fast responder. And normally it also hampers the ability to be strategic, because you have so many voices and so many stakeholders in the system. However, on the strong side, on the plus side, it does mean that the EU has multiple resources. It has its member states that can act on their own. It has its institutions, and with the recovery fund, the whole idea is that states borrow and the institutions guarantee for that borrowing on the basis of their own resources. And, the institutions have been empowered to increase their own resources. It means that you have, for instance, globally, you have the EU diplomatic network plus the diplomatic network of 27 member states. These are assets, these are strengths. It also, it's still the largest market, so it has plenty of assets on the economic front. So it's a bit of a burdensome elephant, shall we say, a bit slow at responding, but it does have strengths that individual countries don't necessarily have. And that's a bit the sort of nature of the EU. There's obviously a lot of discussion in the academic world as to what is, the nature of the beast. And in order to capture it, one needs to understand that it's a bit of both. It's a bit of many things, and with strengths and weaknesses. So, for instance, in this particular case, the fact that the EU in and of itself doesn't have health competencies because those belong to the member states, and in some cases they're even, delegated to the regional level. I mean, in Germany, in Italy, it's the regions that take care of health. So that hasn't made it fit really for this particular pandemic. But again, look at the US. The US too, on health matters and on lockdown measures, etc. Depends on the state.
Absolutely.
But now that it has solid guidance from the US administration, things have changed. I mean, the Biden administration has really managed to turn the coronavirus situation up on its head and give this sort of centralized steer. The EU, we don't have that in the EU. We never have had it. If it's happened, it has been largely down to personalities who could wield a lot of respect and authority. But the institutional architecture of the EU remains without a strong leadership.
And we'll be right back to talk more about the EU's changing relationships with China and the United States. Rosa, a few weeks ago, you had the opportunity to moderate the first public discussion between U.S. Secretary of State Tony Blinken and NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg in Blinken's inaugural trip to Brussels as Secretary of State. How did the discussion line up with expectations about what the transatlantic alliance writ large, meaning both formal and informal, can achieve and where its priorities are?
Well, I have to say, these are, two very personal observations. First of all, both the Secretary of State Blinken and Secretary General of NATO Stoltenberg were very genuine. It felt that they believed in what they were saying. And secondly, it was such a contrast with the past, this ease and this agreement between them, which actually makes you realize how tense relations have been beforehand. So I came out of that meeting feeling very positive about the potential relaunch, really, of the transatlantic relationship, of NATO, and the relationship between the EU and the US more generally. It was, and I do think that the two things I think that are important. The first is that Secretary of State Blinken underlines repeatedly that the US is willing to listen. And I think that was a very important message for Europeans. They felt that at that point it was possible to start the conversation again. And I don't think they had felt it before in the same way. And of course, President Biden also participated in the European Council meeting virtually. But this insistence on wanting to listen to allies, I think, came down very well with European political leaders here. And the second, the insistence on the US's side on the need for alliances. Again, same point. This sunk in very well, very nicely among Europeans, and I think it's altered a little bit the discussion here about to what degree does Europe want to be autonomous from the US, about EU-China relations and the autonomy from the US in pursuing them. It's changed the debate somewhat, and I would say in ways that are positive for the transatlantic relationship.
And all of that was the through line of Biden's campaign, the emphasis on allies and partnerships around the world, and an important signal sending Blinken to NATO. So aside from those positive things that you mentioned in areas for cooperation, what do you think will be some of the largest thorns in the transatlantic relationship in the coming years?
I think most European political leaders have been quite slow in recognizing or acknowledging that China wasn't what they thought it was. They thought it was a rising power that could be integrated into the global economy and somehow reined in through multilateralism, and that China would not act in an aggressive way as it has been recently. So Europeans were really quite taken by surprise when China retaliated on sanctions against groups of ambassadors, against some analysts.
And this is for the criticism of their treatment of the Uyghurs.
Well, it's because the EU has, together with the US, the UK, Canada, etc., have issued some restrictive measures against several individuals because of the Uyghurs. So that is and China retaliated in ways that are not really commensurate to the sanctions that Europeans have issued towards these individuals in China. And the EU was taken by surprise by this. The EU had been, emphasizing the need for respect for human rights with China for many years. It had been, in the past, the EU used to travel, EU leaders used to travel to Tibet to meet the Dalai Lama. So it's not as if it hasn't mentioned these. They've increasingly become a bit of a, repeated message without much content. And then all of a sudden, the EU also decided to issue sanctions And but it had been an item on the agenda for bilateral relations between the EU and China for some time.
Right.
So they weren't expecting the retaliatory sanctions. And I think it's a bit of a wake-up call for Europeans as to how China is engaging with its partners. Couple that with the mask diplomacy, with the vaccine diplomacy, with an increasingly aggressive stance in Asia, and of course with pressure from the US that Europeans align themselves a bit more firmly with the US against China. These are all big challenges. Now, the EU will probably not see the rise of China in such in terms of such an existential threat as the US does, but it doesn't want an escalation of tension. So I think the EU will try and position itself in such a way to attempt to de-escalate. The second point that is important for the EU is to engage with China on climate talks, and I think the EU will try to keep that door open and perhaps be a bit of a go-between Washington and Beijing on the climate front, where the EU already has a certain degree of leadership. So these are areas where the EU can perhaps be quite helpful for the US administration, but also where it might not see eye to eye with the US. And China is probably the biggest and greatest challenge. There are, of course, other areas as well. Technology, taxation, a few trade issues, which are complicated. Here again, I mean, there are two trends. On the one hand, there are very different approaches in the EU and in the US towards, for instance, technology. The US has a much more market-based model and the EU has a much more regulatory model. But on the other hand, I also see the debate changing in the US. I mean, now there's talk about, global taxation for great companies.
Right.
So these are moving issues where it's not just how Europeans position themselves, it's also how the US will change. But what will be important would be to talk about these issues in the context of the relationship between the US and the EU.
And on China, as you said, the EU can be both sort of partner, but it has its own interests. How would you define the EU's interest in China aside from it as sort of a trade partner, which you said had been sort of the previous approach?
Yeah, I mean, the problem in defining the EU's interests is that it's never quite clear what it is altogether. So for Germany, China is a great trade partner. China buys a lot of German stuff. For other countries, China has been an investor. For instance, and again, let's go back to the Eurozone crisis, the poorer and more peripheral countries that were badly hit by the Eurozone crisis were Greece, Cyprus, Portugal. These are countries where China has been making infrastructural investments that nobody else has been doing. So these countries have benefited at a time of great economic and financial distress from Chinese investments. And in some cases, it appears that China wants, payback time and, asks maybe member states to vote against sanctions, for instance, in the context of, human rights conversations. And this has happened. So for these reasons, so you don't have a unique interest with respect to China in the EU. You have differentiated interests. But also different viewpoints as to what the role of China is. This makes it very difficult to build up a common position on China. I mean, I would expect, so many people were very surprised. At the end of 2020, the EU negotiated a comprehensive agreement on investments with China to the displeasure of the incoming administration in the US.
Yes, very interestingly timed.
Yeah, exactly. And then, 2 months later, it's issuing sanctions against some Chinese officials. And that might seem a little bit schizophrenic. So the point is that because you have these different interests, there are times when a certain group of interests prevails, and in this case, the comprehensive agreement on investments was very much demanded by Germany and German private sector. And then in other cases, you have the sort of human rights defenders in the EU, Baltic states, the Netherlands, Ireland, those that have, invested more heavily on international human rights. They build the pressure to get sanctions on, and it's always this. In the EU, everything is always negotiated, and the trade-offs. So sometimes externally the outcomes seem to be a bit contradictory, but it's actually to do with the political processes that take place within the system, in the decision making.
So given the two things that you mentioned, both the fact that the United States is now listening to allies, but also this incredible complexity in terms of all the member states and their views on China, how do you see the path for the United States and its European allies to come up with a coordinated approach to China, or is that possible? Will it be ad hoc? Will it be strategic? What do you see as the future here?
The first thing, I think there's a certain degree of repositioning globally. So the US is listening to its allies in Europe, but also elsewhere. So what we're seeing is that the US is picking up allies in trying to contain China, also in Asia. So this sort of global repositioning will have an influence. Will have an impact. It also means that China will also take measures in response to this. And I can't say what China will do. We'll need to see. But basically, we're in a period of flux. Okay, we're moving from the end of the Cold War long shadow, which has been rather chaotic chaotic I think is the right word. And we're moving towards something else. We don't really know what that else will be. It won't be multilateralism as we know it, but it will be a place where other countries such as India, Japan, Australia, South Korea will play a bigger role. And it is to be hoped that the global South will be included in this. But of course, we also need to factor in the post-pandemic recovery of the global South, which is going to be very difficult. It's going to be and might take some time. So that's one trend, which means that rather than imagining alliances as stable, we should imagine them a little bit more in flux. So the transatlantic relationship we know is solid, but it's likely to be activated. It's likely to be accompanied by other more fluid alliances, depending on the issues at stake. And so, with respect to the US, the EU, and China, I see that the climate conversation will continue, and that the US and the EU can be aligned. On other issues, they might have to beg to differ, but they need to manage the sort of cohabitation in the transatlantic relationship. And then the US, as it has been doing, will invest also in its relationships in other parts of the world, and so will the EU. The EU is, beginning to look at designing an Indo-Pacific strategy, for instance. It wants to reach out much more heavily and on a different basis with respect to Africa. So we're going to see more fluidity and differentiation in the international context. With NATO remains the most important security alliance globally. There's no equivalent elsewhere. And then perhaps an agreement between the US and the EU of a slightly different division of labour.
We'll be back in a moment to discuss the future of the EU and the bloc's changing identity. Rosa, in a recent piece for Carnegie, you wrote that the pandemic is exposing some of the EU's contradictions. You also talked about the dangers of promoting a, quote, European civilization. And the idea of one pan-European political and social identity is a question that has challenged Europe for some time. We've seen occasional spats between Turkey and France, for instance. It has also come up in the context of the European reaction to the important Black Lives Matter movement, which we talked about the last time you were on the podcast. What's behind this idea of European civilization, and how has the pandemic affected perceptions of a common Europe?
So there's always been this strong quest to give this strange animal that we talked about, the EU, a sense of identity, so that citizens and the public could have a sense of loyalty towards the organisation, and it's never really taken off. This idea has never taken off. Whenever there are plenty of academic debates, intellectual debates about where Europe begins and where it ends, and what the history is and how to define it. And recently, and I have to say, I do think it is because of the Trump years that this debate has accelerated in the EU. There's been a lot more talk about the EU becoming more autonomous from a strategic point of view, building its identity. And of these contributions, which are very interesting, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, has been really the most articulate. And he frames the discussion in civilizational terms. He says, the European civilization is at risk because of geopolitical rivalries, because of demography, and therefore we need to build one. And to be honest, this was what motivated me to say, no, this is not what the EU ought to be about. The EU is a civic project. It's about governance, really. It's not necessarily about building identities. All the more that if one seeks to find some kind of linear evolution of the European idea, rooting it in the Enlightenment, which is what Macron does, you're actually excluding a whole part of European history, which is absolutely critical to what we are now. One is the history of empire, and how much Europe's wealth is actually built on the foundations of empire and exploitation of the global south. And the second is the history of immigration. Europe is a multicultural society. And it's a multicultural, the EU is a multicultural society, but not just because it has 27 member states, but because each society is built upon decades and centuries of immigration towards Europe, which make it such a lively environment, not to the same degree as the United States, which is a country of immigration, but still important. There are important cultures, languages, religions, ethnicities represented in Europe. So if you try to, and I can understand politically the need to build some loyalty towards the EU and to think in European-wide terms and not just in national terms. I can understand that need, but to build it upon an idea of a civilization that has linearly grown since the Enlightenment, embracing the principles of democracy and human rights, that's not really that's not really a reflection of the true history of Europe. What one can say is that the EU and its member states have embraced a set of universal principles, such as democracy and human rights, and that the civic loyalty towards these principles is a defining feature of this organization. But it's not about civilization, it's about how we choose to organize our societies.
You've mentioned before that Europe's youth is at risk of becoming a so-called lost generation because of the pandemic. As leadership changes over the coming years, is there a risk that young people will grow disillusioned with the ideas of European integration?
Yes, there is a risk that the youth will become disenchanted with the European Union as a project. Until a generation ago, the whole raison d'être of the European integration was about peace on the continent. But of course, young people do not have memories, or they do not have grandparents or parents who grew up during the Second World War, who invested in building peace in the EU. So the peace model, message of the European Union does not have traction. And the European leaders are failing the democracy message of the European Union integration because in some countries, democratic standards are failing dramatically. And now the current leadership is embracing the climate messaging. And this is very important. We've seen the Fridays for Future. We've seen the younger generation. This is something that mobilizes the younger generation. So the leadership of the EU is clinging on to building a climate agenda for the EU, which will resonate with the public. But the problem with the pandemic is that kids have been locked up at home. University students have not been able to lead a normal life socializing on campuses. School students also have had similar challenges. In some countries, schools have been closed for months. And unless we get these younger people out and about, I think the risks that they will be disaffected by politics in general and the EU are very high. And let's not forget, Europe is a continent that is aging.
Right.
And very often, the short-term strategies of political leaders is to make choices that will get them re-elected. And those who are voting are the older people. And so often the policies are not designed for the young. And then add to this that in addition to the demography of aging, you also have, from some of the poorer countries, a lot of emigration of young people, especially those educated, but not only. So you're seeing massive brain drain from Bulgaria, Romania, but also more affluent countries that don't offer many opportunities for youth. And I'm thinking of Spain, where youth unemployment has actually hit close to 40% with the pandemic, and Italy. So if nobody's designing policies for these people, instead, because of the pandemic, we're locking them up, we're not vaccinating them, then that really is, I think, for those who are between 18 and 25, this really is a time of great loss of opportunity and loss of life, because they can't lead the normal lives that we had the fortune of leading when we went to university.
Yeah, it's been such a tremendous year of loss, and it is definitely interesting to think about what this will mean over the long term for the youth you've been talking about, those around the world, and how this entire year will have affected us. Rosa, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you, Laura.
Till next time. Thank you for listening to The World Unpacked, produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We're grateful for your listen and eager for your feedback. We welcome your emails at podcasts@ceip.org. And please rate and review us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find me, Laura Lucas Magnuson, on Twitter @Laura L. Magnuson. These discussions are only made possible by our wonderful team behind the pod. Our audio engineer is Tim Martin, and our executive producer is Maya Krishna Rogers. We'll see you next time.